In the winter of 1840, Eleanor Ashford does something unthinkable. She purchases a man from a debtor's auction, a broken soul named Lucien Moreau, who kneels in chains with hollow eyes that have forgotten hope. What the town whispers about as charity, what her family condemns as madness, is actually something far more inexplicable. For 3 years, Eleanor has dreamed of a man with those exact eyes. A shadow figure who speaks to her in a language older than English, who kisses her with lips cold as December frost, who whispers that he has been waiting centuries for her. The practical daughter of a deceased physician never believed in fate or folklore, yet when she sees Lucien on that auction block, trembling and skeletal, something ancient in her chest recognizes him. She does not know that the broken man she brings home to heal is actually Lucien Thibault de Valois, a 300-year-old vampire who has been cursed to forget his true nature, condemned to live as human, to suffer human frailty, to die a human death unless the woman from his own recurring dreams saves him. Neither knows the other has been dreaming. Neither knows that their connection was forged in blood and stardust long before either was born. And neither knows that saving each other will require a sacrifice that will test whether love can transcend the boundaries between life and death itself. The auction house stank of desperation and unwashed bodies, a combination that made Eleanor Ashford press her handkerchief against her nose as she pushed through the crowd of gentlemen speculators and labor contractors. This was not a place for women, especially not unmarried women of respectable birth, and she felt the weight of scandalized stares following her like stones. Her late father's colleague, Dr. Marcus Webb, gripped her elbow with increasing urgency. "Eleanor, this is madness. Your father would never have approved. These are criminals, debtors, the dregs of society." His whisper was harsh with genuine concern, but Eleanor barely heard him. Her attention had been captured completely by the man being dragged onto the platform, and the world had narrowed to just him and the sudden, violent hammering of her heart. He was dying. That much was obvious to anyone with medical knowledge, and Eleanor had assisted her father enough times to recognize the signs. The man's wrists were bound with rope that bit into flesh already raw and infected. His clothes were little more than rags that hung from a frame so thin she could count his ribs through the tears in his shirt. But it was his face that stole her breath. Hollow cheeks covered in several weeks of dark beard, lips cracked and bloodied, skin pale as parchment, and eyes that were the color of smoke and ashes, grey and infinite and utterly, completely empty. Those eyes swept across the jeering crowd without seeing, without hope, without even the dignity of shame. He was a man who had already died inside, just waiting for his body to catch up to the truth. Eleanor's hands began to tremble. She knew this face. God help her, she knew it as well as her own. For 3 years, since the night of her 23rd birthday, this man had come to her in dreams. Not every night, but often enough that she had stopped mentioning it to anyone after her sister had suggested she see a specialist for nervous disorders. In those dreams he was different, stronger, powerful, dressed in clothing from another era entirely, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously terrified and cherished. He spoke to her in French, though her waking self barely understood the language, whispering words that felt like prayers and promises. He touched her face with hands that were cold as winter stone, kissed her with lips that tasted of copper and midnight, and told her again and again, "Je t'ai attendu. J'ai attendu si longtemps. I have waited for you. I have waited so long." She had convinced herself, over years of rational thinking, that these were simply the fantasies of a lonely woman, the creation of a mind that read too many Gothic novels and spent too many evenings alone after her father's death. But now, staring at this broken man on the auction platform, Eleanor felt the careful architecture of her skepticism crumble into dust. The auctioneer was speaking, his voice cutting through her shock. Lucien Moreau, convicted of debts totaling £43, unable to pay, suitable for labor contracting for a term of 7 years or until debt is satisfied. Gentlemen, he's thin now, but he'll recover with proper feeding. Young enough to be trained. Starting bid, £5. The crowd was silent. No one wanted a man this close to death. The cost of nursing him to health would exceed any labor value, assuming he even survived. Eleanor found herself moving forward before conscious thought caught up with action. Her voice, when it emerged, sounded strange to her own ears, too loud and too certain. £50. The crowd turned as one body, a wave of shocked masculine faces, registering first surprise, then recognition, then scandalous delight. Miss Eleanor Ashford, daughter of the late and respected Dr. Thomas Ashford, bidding on a male debtor. The gossip would spread through their small Hampshire town, like wildfire through dry wheat. Dr. Webb grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise. "Eleanor, stop this immediately. You don't know what you're doing." But she did know, or at least some part of her that existed deeper than reason knew. This was the man from her dreams, and he was dying. And something in the universe had brought her to this exact moment. And if she walked away now, she would regret it for whatever remained of her life. The auctioneer recovered his composure quickly, greed overtaking surprise. £50 to the lady. Do I hear 55? Silence. No one was fool enough to compete with an offer that high for such poor merchandise, and no one wanted to be seen bidding against a woman in any case. Sold then to Miss Eleanor Ashford for £50. The gavel came down with a crack that sounded like a bone breaking. Eleanor's hands were shaking so badly she could barely sign the papers, barely count out the money from her reticule, where she had brought nearly all her remaining savings on an instinct she hadn't understood until now. Dr. Webb had gone silent beside her. His face a mask of disappointment and worry that cut her more deeply than anger would have. When they brought Lucien Moreau down from the platform, he stumbled, and Eleanor instinctively reached out to steady him. The moment her hand touched his arm, his head snapped up, and for the first time those dead grey eyes focused, really focused on her face. Something flickered in their depths, recognition or confusion, or perhaps just fever, and his cracked lips moved soundlessly. Then his eyes rolled back and he collapsed entirely, his weight dragging them both toward the filthy floor until Dr. Webb caught them. "You've bought yourself a corpse," Webb said grimly. But he helped her nevertheless, because he had loved her father and by extension had some duty to the daughter. Between them, they half-carried, half-dragged Lucien Moreau out to Eleanor's small carriage, drawing stares and whispers the entire way. In the close confines of the carriage, Eleanor could smell him, sickness and infection, and beneath that something else, something almost metallic, like old blood and tarnished silver. His head lolled against the seat, unconscious or perhaps simply too weak to hold it upright, and in the grey afternoon light filtering through the window, his face looked almost transparent, as if he were already becoming a ghost. Dr. Webb sat across from them, his medical instincts overriding his disapproval as he checked Lucien's pulse at the wrist, lifted one eyelid to peer at the dilated pupil beneath. Severe malnutrition, obvious infections in the rope wounds, possibly consumption given the breathing, likely has fever, though it's hard to tell. "Eleanor, he needs a hospital, not your spare bedroom. He needs care you cannot provide alone." But Eleanor shook her head stubbornly. "He needs someone who will not give up on him. Hospitals let paupers die in the corridors. You know this as well as I do." It was true enough. Her father had often railed against the conditions in public hospitals, the way the poor were treated as inconveniences rather than patients. Webb sighed, recognizing the set of her jaw, the same stubborn determination that had made her father both a brilliant physician and a financial disaster, treating those who could never pay. "Then at least let me help you. God knows you'll need it." His voice was gentler now, resigned. "Though I warn you, Eleanor, this will destroy what remains of your reputation. An unmarried woman taking a strange man into her home. The town will crucify you." Eleanor looked down at Lucien Moreau's face, at the sharp lines of cheekbones pressing against skin, at the dark lashes resting against pale cheeks, at the slight movement of breath that proved he still lived despite appearing otherwise. In her mind, she heard his dream voice, that accent that curled around words like smoke. The desperate repetition of "Je t'ai attendu." Something in her chest ached with a longing she did not fully understand, a recognition that transcended logic. "Let them talk," she said quietly. "I have done stranger things than show Christian charity." Though charity was not exactly what this was, and both she and Webb knew it. This was something else entirely, something that defied the rational world her father had taught her to navigate, something that belonged to the realm of her secret dreams, and the growing certainty that fate, despite her skepticism, had plans she could not escape. The carriage rolled through the streets of Ashford Commons, past the shops closing for the evening, past the church where her father was buried, past the houses of families who had known her since childhood and would, by tomorrow, know of her scandalous purchase. Eleanor kept her hand on Lucien's arm, feeling the heat of fever burning through the thin fabric of his sleeve, feeling his pulse flutter weak and irregular beneath her fingers. She thought about the dreams, about the way Dream Lucien had held her as if she were something precious and impossible, had looked at her with eyes that burned with centuries of longing. She thought about the words he had whispered in French, words she had looked up in her father's old dictionary. Mon âme, ma salvation. Ne me laisse pas, my soul, my salvation. Do not leave me. When they arrived at her small house on the edge of town, the house she had inherited along with debts and her father's medical books and very little else, the sun was setting in streaks of red and gold that looked like blood and fire. Dr. Webb helped her carry Lucien inside, up the narrow stairs to the spare bedroom that had once been her father's study. They laid him on the bed, and Eleanor immediately began the familiar routines her father had taught her, checking for injuries, cleaning the infected wounds at his wrists with carbolic solution that made him moan even in unconsciousness, covering him with blankets to fight the fever chills that racked his thin frame. Webb watched her work with a mixture of professional approval and personal worry. "I'll send my housekeeper with supplies," he said finally, "and I'll return tomorrow to check on him. Eleanor, I mean this with all concern. Please be careful. You know nothing about this man, about what he may have done, who he may be." Eleanor nodded without looking up from wrapping clean bandages around Lucien's wrists, around wounds that looked weeks old and deliberately ignored, as if he had been kept in chains without basic care. "Thank you, Marcus, for everything." Webb left reluctantly, and Eleanor heard the front door close, heard his carriage pull away, and then there was only silence and the sound of Lucien's labored breathing. She sat in the chair beside the bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest, watching fever sweat bead on his forehead, and she felt no fear at all. Instead, she felt a strange, deep certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be, that every decision in her life had been leading her to this moment, to this man, to this inexplicable connection that defied everything she thought she knew about the world. As night fell completely, Eleanor lit the oil lamp on the bedside table, casting the room in warm, flickering light. In that glow, Lucien's face looked less corpse-like, more simply exhausted, as if he had been fighting a war for far too long and had finally been given permission to rest. She reached out hesitantly and brushed a strand of dark hair back from his forehead, and at her touch, his eyes fluttered open, those grey eyes that were smoke and ash and infinite sorrow. For a moment he stared at her without comprehension, and then something shifted, some recognition that made his breath catch, made his hand move weakly toward her face before falling back to the blanket, too heavy, too weak. His lips moved, forming words without sound, and Eleanor leaned closer to hear. "You," he whispered in English accented with French, his voice a ruined rasp. "You are real. I thought I had finally died and dreamed you." His eyes closed again, consciousness slipping away like water through fingers, but Eleanor sat back with her heart thundering. He knew her, just as she knew him. This was not coincidence. This was not chance. This was something else entirely. And Eleanor Ashford, daughter of science and reason, found herself believing in the impossible after all. The first 3 days were a battle against death itself, and there were hours when Eleanor genuinely believed she would lose. Lucien's fever spiked dangerously high on the second night, his body convulsing with chills despite the mountain of blankets she piled on him. His skin burning so hot she could feel the heat radiating before her hand even touched his forehead. He thrashed in delirium, speaking in rapid French that her limited understanding could barely follow. Fragments about darkness and blood, and someone named Isabel, about forgiveness and damnation, and time running out like sand through broken glass. Dr. Webb came twice daily, bringing medicines and disapproval in equal measure, though even he had to admit that Eleanor's nursing was beyond reproach. She barely slept, catching moments in the chair beside Lucien's bed, waking at every changed breath, every moan of pain or confusion. On the third night, the fever finally broke. Eleanor woke from an exhausted doze to find Lucien staring at her with clear eyes, the grey no longer glazed with delirium, but sharp and aware, and filled with an emotion she could not name. "You stayed," he said, his voice still rough but stronger than before. It was not a question, but a statement of wonder, as if the concept of someone remaining was foreign to him. Eleanor straightened in her chair, suddenly aware of how she must look, her hair falling from its pins, her dress rumpled, dark circles beneath her eyes. "Of course I stayed. You were very ill." She reached for the water glass on the bedside table, helped him sit up enough to drink, supporting his shoulders with her arm. He was stronger than 3 days ago, but still terribly weak, his hands shaking as they closed around the glass. After he drank, he fell back against the pillows, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he were reading secrets written on her skin. "Why did you buy me?" The question was direct, without preamble or social cushioning. "You do not know me. You risked your reputation, your resources. Why?" Eleanor found herself unable to hold that grey gaze, looking instead at her hands folded in her lap, at the ink stains on her fingers from the medical notes she had been keeping. How could she explain what she did not fully understand herself? That she had dreamed of him for 3 years? That the moment she saw him, something in her soul had screamed that she had to save him or lose something essential to her own existence? "I saw someone in need," she said finally, the answer both true and insufficient. "My father taught me that we have a duty to help those who suffer." Lucien made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had not been so bitter. "Christian charity, then? How disappointed you must be to discover your charity purchased a man with nothing to offer in return, not even gratitude." There was something harsh in his voice, something that spoke of deep wounds that had nothing to do with the infections on his wrists. Eleanor looked up sharply, meeting those grey eyes directly now, seeing past the weakness to something else, something that reminded her powerfully of the man in her dreams. The way he had looked at her with centuries of pain. "I do not want your gratitude," she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "I want you to live. That is payment enough." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, or perhaps the beginning of something like hope, quickly suppressed as if hope were a luxury he could no longer afford. Over the following days, as Lucien grew slowly stronger, Eleanor began to learn fragments of his story, though he told it reluctantly, as if each word cost him something. He was French, from a family that had once been wealthy, but had fallen on desperate times during the Revolution. He had come to England 15 years ago, he said, though the way he said it made it sound like he was unsure of the exact time, as if years had blurred together. He had worked various positions, tutor and translator and clerk, always moving, never settling, and somehow the debts had accumulated through bad luck and worse decisions, until he found himself in chains at a debtor's auction. The story had gaps large enough to drive a carriage through, inconsistencies that Eleanor's rational mind catalogued even as her heart ached for the loneliness she heard beneath the words. There was something he was not telling her, something significant, but she did not push. Trust, she sensed, would have to be earned slowly with this man who had learned to expect nothing good from the world. What surprised her most was his education. Once he was strong enough to sit up for extended periods, she brought him books from her father's library, expecting him to choose novels or light reading. Instead, he selected medical texts, philosophy, ancient history, reading with a hunger that suggested these were not new subjects, but old friends he was revisiting. He read Latin and Greek as easily as English, corrected an error in one of her father's anatomical drawings with the precision of someone who had studied such things extensively. "Where did you learn medicine?" Eleanor asked one afternoon, watching him turn pages of a surgical manual with careful reverence. Lucien did not look up from the book, but she saw his jaw tighten. "Another life," he said quietly. "Or perhaps it simply feels that way. Time has a way of making the past seem unreal. The dreams continued, but they changed." Now, when Eleanor slept, she dreamed of Lucien not as the powerful, otherworldly figure from before, but as he was now, fragile and human, and heartbreakingly vulnerable. In these new dreams, she saw fragments of his past, images that came without context or explanation. A grand house burning, flames reaching toward a night sky. A woman with dark hair and Lucien's grey eyes screaming. Chains and darkness, and the overwhelming sensation of suffocation. And always, beneath everything, a terrible thirst. A hunger that felt like dying from the inside out. She would wake gasping, her heart racing, and would go to check on Lucien, finding him either sleeping peacefully or, more often, awake and staring at the ceiling as if it held answers he could not quite decipher. They never spoke of these nighttime visits, but she thought he knew. Thought he waited for her footsteps on the stairs. It was during the second week that the first truly strange thing happened, though Eleanor tried to rationalize it away, even as it occurred. She had been changing the bandages on Lucien's wrists, noting with medical satisfaction that the infections had healed remarkably fast, faster than should have been possible given how severe they had been. But as she unwrapped the old bandage from his left wrist, she froze. The wound was gone, not healed over with scar tissue, not scabbed and pink, but completely, utterly gone, as if it had never existed at all. His skin was smooth and unmarked, pale but perfect. She stared at it, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes clearly saw, and when she looked up at Lucien's face, she found him watching her, with an expression of such profound fear that it stopped her breath. "How?" she whispered, and the single word contained 1,000 questions. Lucien pulled his arm back slowly, covering his wrist with his other hand as if he could hide what she had already seen. His face had gone even paler than usual, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I do not know. Things happen to me sometimes, things I cannot explain. I thought perhaps I was mad, that the fever had damaged my mind. But you see it too." His grey eyes searched hers desperately. "You see it, do you not? I'm not imagining this?" Eleanor's scientific training warred with the evidence before her, with the impossible fact of a wound that had vanished as if it had never been. Every rational explanation her mind offered crumbled against the simple truth that she had seen that wound, had cleaned and dressed it daily, had watched it fester, and now it was simply gone. "I see it," she confirmed quietly, and watched relief and fresh fear chase each other across his face. She reached for his other wrist, the one still bandaged, and he let her unwrap it with the resignation of a man facing execution. That wound too was gone, vanished without a trace. Eleanor sat back, her hands trembling slightly, her mind racing through possibilities and finding none that made sense. "Have you always healed this way?" Lucien shook his head, the movement jerky and uncertain. "I do not think so. I remember being injured before, remember scars, but my memory is strange, fragmented. There are years I cannot fully recall, as if someone took pieces of my life and removed them, leaving only holes where certainty should be." He looked at his unmarked wrists with an expression close to horror. "Sometimes I feel as if I'm forgetting who I truly am, as if the person I was is dying and someone else is taking his place. And I do not know which one is real." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest, a premonition she could not name. She thought of her dreams, of the way Dream Lucien had seemed both human and not, the way his skin had been cold as stone, the way his eyes had held centuries instead of decades. She thought of the impossible healing, of the gaps in his memory, of the sense she had from the beginning that there was something otherworldly about this man she had brought into her home. "Lucien," she said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. "Has anyone ever suggested to you that you might be something other than human?" The question hung in the air between them, absurd and terrifying and somehow inevitable. Lucien stared at her as if she had struck him, his grey eyes going wide with something that looked like recognition, mixed with absolute denial. "No," he said, but the word came out too quickly, too forcefully, the protest of someone trying to convince himself rather than her. "That is impossible. I'm a man, simply a man. I eat and sleep and bleed like any other." But even as he said it, doubt flickered across his face, and Eleanor remembered the metallic smell that had surrounded him when she first brought him home, remembered the way he had seemed almost transparent in certain lights, remembered a dozen small things that had not made sense, but that she had dismissed because they could not be real. "Do you?" she asked gently. "Bleed like others? Because your wounds suggest otherwise." Lucien stood abruptly, swaying with the effort, gripping the bedpost for support. His face was a mask of confusion and rising panic. "I need air. I need to think. I cannot—" He trailed off, looking around the small bedroom as if it were a cage closing in on him. Eleanor rose quickly, concerned he would fall. "You are still too weak to be walking about." But Lucien shook his head stubbornly, that flash of the commanding figure from her dreams showing through the fragile exterior. "I've been in this room for 2 weeks. I'm stronger now. Please, I just need a moment away from questions I cannot answer." His voice cracked on the last words, and Eleanor's heart twisted with sympathy. She was pushing him, she realized, pushing at wounds that went far deeper than the physical, and in her eagerness to understand the mystery, she was forgetting the frightened man at the center of it. "Of course," she said softly, stepping back to give him space. "Come downstairs when you are ready. I will make tea." It was a mundane offering, absurdly normal in the face of impossible healing and questions about humanity. But sometimes the mundane was exactly what was needed. She left him there, descended the narrow stairs to her small kitchen, and went through the mechanical motions of building up the fire, heating water, preparing the tea service her mother had left her. Her hands were steady despite her racing thoughts, years of practice allowing her to function even as her mind spun through implications that threatened to overturn everything she believed about the world. If Lucien was not human, or not entirely human, what did that make him? The logical part of her brain suggested mental illness, suggested that both she and Lucien were experiencing some form of shared delusion. But the healed wounds were real. She had touched that smooth, unmarked skin. That was not delusion. That was fact, however impossible. She heard Lucien's footsteps on the stairs, slow and careful, and when he entered the kitchen, she saw that he had managed to dress himself in the clothes Dr. Webb had brought. Simple trousers and a shirt that hung loose on his still thin frame. He had shaved as well, using the razor and basin she had left in his room. And without the beard, his face was startlingly young. The face of a man, perhaps 30 years old, though his eyes held ages beyond that. He sat at the small table without speaking, accepting the cup of tea she poured, wrapping his hands around it as if he were cold despite the warmth of the kitchen fire. They sat in silence for several minutes, sipping tea like civilized people, while the impossible sat between them like an uninvited guest. Finally, Lucien spoke, his voice low and controlled, each word chosen carefully. "There are things I remember, or think I remember, that do not make sense with the life I believe I have lived. Fragments that feel like memories but cannot be real. A different name, a different time. Things that happened centuries ago, described as if I witnessed them myself." He looked up at her, his grey eyes pleading for understanding or perhaps absolution. "I have always dismissed these as fantasies, as dreams that became confused with reality. But what if they are not fantasies? What if the life I think I have lived is the dream, and these fragments are the truth? His hands were shaking, making the teacup rattle in its saucer. What if I am not who I believe myself to be at all? Eleanor reached across the table, covering his trembling hands with her own, feeling the coolness of his skin, even through the warmth of the teacup. "Then we will discover the truth together," she said firmly. "Whatever it may be, you are not alone in this." The words were a promise, one she made without fully understanding the cost, without knowing that this decision would change both their lives in ways that could never be undone. Lucien looked at their joined hands, as if the simple touch were something miraculous and forbidden, and when he met her eyes again, there were tears on his lashes, silver in the lamplight. "Why?" he asked, the question he had asked before, but with different weight now, deeper meaning. "Why do you care what happens to me? You should be frightened. You should send me away," Eleanor smiled, sad and certain all at once. "I have been dreaming of you for 3 years, she said quietly, finally speaking the truth she had been holding back. "A man with grey eyes who speaks French and holds me as if I am the answer to a prayer. I did not believe in fate or destiny until I saw you on that auction platform and knew your face before you even looked at me. So no, I am not frightened of you, Lucien Moreau, or whoever you truly are. I think perhaps I have been waiting for you just as long as you have been waiting for me, and I will not abandon you now, when we are finally beginning to understand why." The confession hung in the air between them, too honest, too raw, laying bare feelings she had barely admitted to herself. Lucien stared at her as if she had just handed him the world, as if those simple words had given him something he had thought lost forever. His lips moved soundlessly, and then, in barely more than a whisper, he spoke in French, the same words she had heard 100 times in dreams. "Je t'ai attendu. Mon Dieu, j'ai attendu si longtemps. I have waited for you. My God, I have waited so long." The revelation changed something fundamental between them, as if speaking the truth aloud had broken down a wall that neither had fully acknowledged existed. Over the following days, Lucien began to share more of the strange fragments he remembered, though he still spoke of them hesitantly, as if expecting her to declare him mad at any moment. He remembered a chateau in the Loire Valley, he said, a beautiful house with gardens that ran down to the river. But when he tried to recall details, they slipped away like smoke. He remembered a woman named Isabel, his sister, with dark hair, and their mother's laugh, but he could not remember her face clearly, could not remember if she had lived a long life or died young. Most disturbing, he remembered centuries passing in a kind of half-awareness, as if he had been asleep but not quite, present but not quite, living in shadows and fragments until something had changed, something had broken, and he had found himself fully human, fully mortal, and completely confused about how he had arrived there. Eleanor listened to all of it, recording his words in the journal she had begun keeping, approaching the mystery with the same methodical care her father had taught her to apply to medical puzzles. She noted patterns, inconsistencies, moments when Lucien seemed to almost remember something crucial before it slipped away again. She researched in her father's books, looking for medical conditions that might explain rapid healing or memory loss, finding nothing that quite fit. And increasingly, she found herself drawn to the small section of books her father had collected on folklore and superstition, topics he had studied to better understand his patients' beliefs. It was in one of these books, a dusty volume on European legends, that she found a passage that made her blood run cold with recognition. The passage described creatures called vampires, the undead who subsisted on blood, who possessed unnatural healing and strength, who could not die by normal means and were condemned to live eternally unless destroyed by specific methods. The book treated the subject academically, as folklore rather than fact, but as Eleanor read the descriptions, she felt pieces clicking into place with horrible inevitability. The cold skin, the rapid healing, the metallic smell she had initially noticed. The way Lucien sometimes seemed ageless despite his apparent youth. The memories of centuries, the sense of something otherworldly beneath the human exterior. It was impossible. Vampires were stories to frighten children, gothic romance nonsense, not real entities that could appear at debtors' auctions in Hampshire. Yet as impossible as it was, it explained everything in a way nothing else could. She sat with the book open on her lap for a long time, staring at the words without really seeing them, her mind racing through implications. If Lucien was a vampire or had been one, what did that mean for him now? The book described vampires as immortal, unchanging, yet Lucien was clearly changing, growing weaker in some fundamental way she could sense even as his body healed. It was as if his vampiric nature was draining away, leaving him increasingly human and increasingly mortal. A curse, she thought suddenly, remembering fragments from his fevered delirium about damnation and punishment. What if he had been cursed to become human, to suffer human frailty, to die a human death? And if so, who had cursed him and why, and was there any way to break it? She found Lucien in the small garden behind the house, standing in the weak March sunlight, with his face turned upward, his eyes closed. She had noticed over the past days that he sought out the sun constantly, standing in patches of light that came through windows, sitting in the garden despite the cold. Now watching him, she understood why. If he had been a creature of darkness and shadow, confined to night for centuries, then sunlight must feel like a miracle, like freedom after an unimaginable prison. She approached quietly, not wanting to disturb the peace on his face, but he heard her footsteps and turned, his expression shifting to something more guarded. "You have discovered something," he said, reading her face with the accuracy of someone who had learned to interpret subtle signs. "I can see it in your eyes. You know what I am." Eleanor held up the book. The page opened to the passage on vampires. "I think I might," she said carefully, "though it seems impossible even saying it aloud." Lucien took the book from her hands, his eyes scanning the text, and she watched the color drain from his face, watched his hands begin to tremble. He read in silence for several long minutes, and when he finally looked up at her, his expression was one of such profound shock and dawning horror that she instinctively stepped forward, reaching for him. "I remember," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Mon Dieu, I remember. How did I forget? How could I have forgotten what I was?" He swayed, and Eleanor caught him, guided him to the small bench beneath the apple tree. Still bare with winter, he sat with his head in his hands, breathing hard, and Eleanor sat beside him, waiting, giving him time to process whatever memories were flooding back. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow with remembered grief. "Lucien Thibault de Valois. That was my name, my true name. I was born in 1523, the second son of a minor noble family. I died in 1547, or I thought I died, attacked on a road by something that drank me dry and left me changed. I was 24 years old, and I have been 24 years old for 300 years. His hands were fisted in his hair, his whole body rigid with tension. I remember everything now, centuries of night, of hunting, of blood. I was a monster, Eleanor, a true monster who killed to survive, who forgot what it meant to be human, who lost myself completely to the darkness." Eleanor felt ice in her veins, but kept her voice steady. "What changed? How did you become human again?" Lucien raised his head, his grey eyes meeting hers, and in them she saw centuries of accumulated pain. "I met a woman 50 years ago, a witch, though I did not know it then. Her name was Marguerite, and she was beautiful and kind, and I made the mistake of believing I could love her without destroying her. But I was wrong. I killed her, Eleanor. I lost control one night and drained her dry, and the last thing she did with her dying breath was curse me. She said I would forget what I was, forget my power, forget everything that made me a vampire, and I would live as a human, suffering as humans suffer, dying as humans die, unless the woman I had been dreaming of for centuries saved me before my mortal body failed completely." The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Eleanor felt the weight of 300 years of loneliness and monstrosity settle on her shoulders, as if it were her own burden. "You have been dreaming of me for centuries," she said quietly, understanding now why those dreams had felt so old, so inevitable. "Just as I have been dreaming of you for years. Marguerite's curse connected us somehow, made me the key to breaking it." Lucien nodded, misery etched in every line of his face. "I have been searching for you in dreams for so long, I had almost given up hope you were real. And when the curse finally took hold 15 years ago, when I began to forget, I panicked. I tried desperately to find you before I lost myself completely. Traveled everywhere, spent money I did not have, fell into debt I could never repay, and eventually lost even the memory of why I was searching. By the time you found me, I had forgotten everything. I was just a dying man who did not understand why death felt like a relief." Eleanor's mind was reeling, trying to process the enormity of what he was telling her. A vampire, 300 years old, a curse, dreams that spanned centuries. It was insane, impossible. Yet she believed him because deep in her soul, she had known from the moment she saw him that he was something extraordinary, something that defied normal explanation. "The healing," she said, understanding now. "Your vampire nature is still trying to protect you, even as the curse makes you mortal. That is why the wounds vanished. You are caught between two natures, and neither is winning." Lucien nodded grimly. "And the human nature is gaining ground. I can feel it, Eleanor. I tire more easily now than even a week ago. I feel hunger, true hunger, not the terrible thirst I remember from before, but normal human hunger. I'm becoming fully mortal, and when that transformation is complete, I will die. The body I'm wearing now is too damaged, too weak. I was dying when you found me, and I am still dying, just more slowly. The thought of losing him, now that she had finally found him, now that she understood who and what he was, felt like a physical pain in Eleanor's chest. She grabbed his hand, holding it tight between both of hers. "Marguerite said I could save you. There must be a way to break the curse, to restore what you were." But even as she said it, she wondered if that was what Lucien wanted. If returning to being a vampire, a killer who fed on blood, would be salvation or damnation. Lucien pulled his hand free gently, standing and moving away from her, his back turned, his shoulders rigid. "Why would you want to save a monster?" His voice was filled with self-loathing that cut her like a blade. "I killed hundreds, Eleanor. Maybe thousands over 3 centuries. I do not deserve salvation. I deserve exactly what I am getting, a human death with all its suffering and fear. It is justice." Eleanor stood as well, moved to stand in front of him, forcing him to look at her. "That was not you," she said firmly. "Or not the you that you are now. You said yourself you lost yourself to the darkness, forgot what it meant to be human. But you remember now. You are choosing now. And the man I see before me is not a monster deserving death, but someone who has suffered more than anyone should have to bear, and who deserves a chance to choose what happens next." Lucien stared at her as if she was speaking a foreign language, as if the concept of deserving anything good was so alien he could not process it. "You do not understand what you are offering," he said quietly. "If the curse breaks, if I return to what I was, the thirst will return. I may not be able to control it. I could hurt you, Eleanor. I could kill you, the one person in 300 years who has shown me genuine kindness." The fear in his voice was real, the fear of a man who had lived with the knowledge of his own monstrosity for so long that it had become part of his identity. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to show weakness when he needed her strength. "Then we will find a way for you to control it," she said. "We will learn together." "But Lucien, I did not dream of you for 3 years, did not risk everything to save you, did not fall in love with you, only to watch you give up and die because you believe you do not deserve to live." The words came out before she could stop them. The confession of love that she had been holding back, and she saw Lucien's eyes widen with shock and something that looked painfully like hope. "You love me," he said, as if testing the words, as if they were something precious and fragile that might shatter if spoken too loudly. "Even knowing what I am, what I have done, you love me." It was not a question, but a statement of wonder, and Eleanor nodded, feeling tears finally slip down her cheeks. "I think I have loved you since the first dream," she admitted. "I did not understand it then, did not believe it was real, but yes, I love you, Lucien Thibault de Valois, vampire and man, monster and miracle. I love all of you, and I will not let you die if there is any way to prevent it." Lucien closed the distance between them in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms with a fierceness that stole her breath, burying his face in her hair. She felt him trembling, felt wetness on her neck that might have been tears. And she held him just as tightly, this impossible man who had lived 300 years and never expected to find love waiting at the end of his curse. "I do not deserve you," he whispered against her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "But God help me, I do not want to let you go." Eleanor pulled back enough to look at his face, seeing the vulnerability there, the love that matched her own shining in those grey eyes. "Then do not," she said simply. "Stay with me. Fight with me. Choose to live, Lucien. Choose us." And then she was kissing him, or he was kissing her. And it did not matter who moved first, because their lips met with the inevitability of stars colliding, with the certainty of something that had been written in fate long before either of them was born. His lips were cool against hers, just as they had been in her dreams, but there was nothing cold about the way he kissed her, nothing distant about the desperation and longing and love that poured from him like water from a broken dam. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lucien rested his forehead against hers, his hands framing her face as if she were something infinitely precious. "I will try," he promised. "I will try to live, to fight, to be worthy of what you offer. But Eleanor, you must promise me something in return." She nodded, willing to promise him anything. "If I cannot control the thirst when it returns, if I become dangerous to you, you must let me go. You must protect yourself, even if it means my death. Promise me?" The thought of making such a promise felt like agreeing to her own execution. But Eleanor saw the genuine fear in his eyes, the terror of a man who loved her enough to risk his own life to keep her safe. "I promise," she whispered, knowing even as she said it that when that moment came, if it came, breaking that promise might be the only way to save them both. The research began in earnest the next morning. Eleanor and Lucien hunched over books in her father's study, looking for anything that might explain how to break or control a witch's curse. They found references to vampires scattered throughout folklore from dozens of cultures, descriptions that varied wildly but agreed on certain essentials: the need for blood, aversion to sunlight, immortality, supernatural strength and healing. None mentioned a vampire becoming human. No stories of curses that could strip away supernatural nature and leave mortality behind. It was unprecedented, which meant they were navigating completely unknown territory with no map to guide them. Lucien's memories were returning in fragments, pieces of 300 years slowly reassembling into coherence, but the process was clearly painful. Each recovered memory bringing with it the weight of experiences he had forgotten for good reason. Dr. Webb came by on the 5th day after the revelation, bringing supplies and news from town, and he found them in the study surrounded by books, making notes, arguing over interpretations of obscure texts. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the scene with his physician's eye for detail, noting the easy familiarity between them. The way Eleanor's hand rested on Lucien's shoulder as she leaned over to read what he was writing. The way Lucien looked up at her with undisguised devotion. Webb cleared his throat, and they both jumped, startled and clearly guilty. "Dr. Webb," Eleanor said too brightly, moving away from Lucien with obvious reluctance. "We did not hear you arrive." Webb smiled, but there was sadness in it. The look of a man watching someone he cares for make a decision he cannot support but cannot prevent. "Eleanor, might I speak with you privately?" It was not really a question, and Eleanor followed him downstairs to the kitchen with a sense of impending lecture. Webb waited until they were behind closed doors before speaking, his voice gentle but firm. "The whole town is talking about you and your French debtor, Eleanor. They say you are living in sin, that you have lost your mind, that your father would be ashamed. I have been defending you where I can, but I cannot shield you from all of it." He paused, studying her face. "What I need to know is whether the gossips are right to be concerned. Are you involved with that man in a way that would compromise your reputation beyond repair?" The question was delicate, dancing around the subject of impropriety, and Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I love him." "Marcus," she said simply, deciding that after everything, simple honesty was the only policy she could live with. "I know it is fast, I know it seems mad, but I love him and he loves me, and I do not care what the town thinks about it." Webb sighed, running his hand through his graying hair. "Love is all well and good, Eleanor, but it does not pay bills or silence gossips. You have very little money left. Your savings are nearly gone, spent on his care and your household. What will you do when there is nothing left? And what of him? Lucien is recovering well, but he is still weak, not fit for heavy labor. How will he support you? How will either of you survive?" The practical questions hit hard because Eleanor had been avoiding thinking about them, too focused on the larger impossibility of curses and vampires to worry about mundane concerns like money. "We will find a way," she said, with more confidence than she felt. "Lucien is educated, skilled. He can tutor or translate once he is fully recovered. I can take in sewing or perhaps find work as a governess." They were weak plans, the desperate calculations of someone with limited options, and Webb's expression said he knew it. "Eleanor, I say this because I care for you as I cared for your father. Marry him." The words were sudden, and Eleanor blinked in surprise. "What?" Webb leaned forward, his expression serious. "Marry him. Soon, before the gossip ruins you completely. It will not silence everyone, but it will give you the protection of respectability. An unmarried woman living with a man is a scandal. A wife caring for her husband is expected. If you love him, if he loves you, make it legal and give yourselves a chance to build something without the weight of society's judgment crushing you." The idea had not occurred to Eleanor, or perhaps she had been avoiding it, unsure whether Lucien would want such a commitment, unsure whether marriage made sense when they did not even know if he would survive his curse-breaking. But Webb was right. Marriage would solve several problems at once, providing social protection and practical benefits. "I will speak with him," she said quietly, and Webb nodded, satisfied. He stayed for tea, making polite conversation about town news, avoiding the subject of her relationship or the gossip surrounding it. When he left, Eleanor stood at the window watching his carriage disappear down the road, gathering her courage for a conversation that would determine the shape of their future. She found Lucien in the garden again, always drawn to the outside, now that he could tolerate sunlight without the pain and limitation he vaguely remembered from his vampire existence. He was examining the small herb garden that Eleanor's father had planted years ago, now overgrown with neglect, pulling dead growth away with careful hands. He looked up when he heard her approach, and the smile that crossed his face was so genuine, so full of simple happiness at her presence, that it made her heart ache. "Marcus thinks we should marry," she said without preamble, deciding directness was better than dancing around the subject. Lucien froze, his hand still tangled in dead lavender stems, his expression shifting rapidly through surprise, hope, fear, and settling on something carefully neutral. "What do you think?" he asked carefully, his accent thicker than usual, as it always was when he was emotional. Eleanor moved closer, reaching out to free his hand from the plants, holding it in hers. "I think that I love you, and you love me, and everything else is details we can work through together. I think that I would be honored to be your wife, if that is something you want." Lucien was very still, staring at their joined hands, and when he looked up at her, there were tears in his eyes. "I have lived 300 years, he said, his voice breaking. "I have seen empires rise and fall. I have watched generations live and die, and in all that time I never thought I would have this. A woman I love, who loves me in return. The possibility of a normal life, a future that looks like hope instead of an endless grey corridor of existence. Yes, Eleanor, yes, I want to marry you. I want it more than I have wanted anything in my entire, very long life. They were married a week later, in a quiet ceremony at the small church, with Dr. Webb and his wife as witnesses, and a priest who looked disapproving, but performed his duty nevertheless. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and Lucien wore the suit that Webb had lent him, looking impossibly young and heartbreakingly vulnerable as he spoke his vows in English and then repeated them in French, his voice steady despite the tears on his face. Eleanor felt the weight of the moment, the knowledge that she was binding her life to a man who was not entirely human, who might not even survive the year, who carried 300 years of darkness in his past. But she also felt the rightness of it, the certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be, standing beside Lucien and promising forever. However long forever turned out to be. The wedding night was both beautiful and terrifying, in ways that had nothing to do with the normal fears of intimacy. Lucien was gentle, almost reverent, touching her as if she might break, kissing her with a desperation that spoke of someone who had never expected to experience such connection. But halfway through their lovemaking, he suddenly froze, pulling away from her with a gasp of horror, his grey eyes going wide and unfocused. "Lucien." Eleanor reached for him, concerned, but he scrambled back, pressing himself against the headboard, his whole body shaking. "The thirst," he gasped out, his voice strangled. "God, Eleanor, the thirst. I can smell your blood, hear your heartbeat, and I want... He could not finish, covering his face with his hands, but Eleanor understood. His vampire nature was returning, triggered perhaps by the intimacy, by the closeness to her living warmth and pulse. She should have been frightened. Every rational part of her brain screamed that she should get away, protect herself, run from the vampire who was looking at her with hunger in his eyes. But instead, she moved closer, reaching out to touch his face gently. "Look at me, Lucien. Look at me, not at what you want." He lowered his hands slowly, his eyes meeting hers, and she saw the battle being waged behind those grey depths. Humanity fighting against instinct, love fighting against hunger. "You are stronger than this," she said firmly. "You are not that creature anymore. You have a choice now, and you are choosing not to hurt me. Focus on that choice. Focus on your love for me, not on the thirst." Her voice was steady, even though her heart was racing, even though she knew she was gambling with her life on the belief that the man she loved was stronger than the monster he had been. Slowly, painfully, the wildness faded from Lucien's eyes, replaced by exhaustion and self-loathing. He slumped against the headboard, looking defeated. "I almost lost control," he whispered. "Eleanor, I almost hurt you on our wedding night. How can you trust me after this?" She moved into his arms, ignoring his attempt to pull away, pressing her face against his chest, feeling his racing heartbeat slowly calm. "Because you did not lose control," she said. "You felt the thirst, and you fought it, and you won. That is what matters." But inside, Eleanor felt the first seeds of real fear take root. If the thirst was returning this quickly, if it could overcome him during moments of intimacy and emotional vulnerability, how long before he could not fight it anymore? How long before love was not enough to keep the monster at bay? The months that followed were a study in contrasts, moments of perfect happiness interspersed with growing dread as Lucien's transformation continued. His memories were fully restored now, 300 years of existence laid out in his mind with painful clarity, and he began to share stories with Eleanor, sitting in the garden on summer evenings, describing a world that no longer existed. He told her about the French court in the Renaissance, about wars and plagues, about watching history unfold from the shadows, about the loneliness of immortality and the way time loses meaning when you have too much of it. He spoke of the people he had killed with the honesty that was sometimes difficult to hear, not trying to justify or minimize, simply acknowledging the truth of what he had been, the monster that necessity and isolation had created, But alongside the restored memories came the returning vampire nature, and it was not a gentle transition. Lucien began to have episodes where the thirst overwhelmed him, usually triggered by strong emotion or physical closeness to Eleanor. He learned to recognize the warning signs, the way his senses would sharpen suddenly, the way her heartbeat would become deafening in his ears, the way the scent of her blood would fill the room like perfume. When he felt it coming, he would leave, disappearing into the woods behind the house for hours, returning pale and shaking but in control. Eleanor respected his need for space during these times, though it hurt to watch him struggle, hurt to know that loving her caused him such pain. His physical strength was returning as well, gradually but undeniably. The terrible weakness that had characterized his early days in her care was fading, replaced by a vitality that seemed almost supernatural, because it was exactly that. He could lift things that should have been impossible for a man of his build, move with a speed and grace that defied normal human capability. His healing accelerated further. Injuries that would take weeks to recover from in a normal person, healing in days or hours. And most strangely, he stopped aging entirely. The subtle signs of wear that appeared on Eleanor's face as summer turned to autumn, the faint lines around her eyes from squinting in sunlight, the slightly weathered quality her hands took on from household work, none of these appeared on Lucien. He remained unchanged, frozen at 24, while she slowly, inexorably aged even in the small ways that months bring. It was this more than anything that made Eleanor realize the fundamental problem they faced. Lucien was not dying anymore. The curse was breaking, his vampire nature returning, and with it came the immortality that had defined 300 years of his existence. But the curse had not fully broken because he still maintained control, still fought the thirst, still chose humanity over monstrosity. He was caught between two states, neither fully human nor fully vampire, and Eleanor began to suspect that this liminal space was somehow dependent on her, on their love, on some mechanism of the curse they did not fully understand. If that was true, what would happen if that balance shifted? What would happen if she was no longer there to anchor him? The thought kept her awake at night, lying beside Lucien and watching him sleep, something vampires supposedly could not do, but he still did, a remnant of the humanity the curse had forced upon him. She histories, their fears, their desperate hopes in the air between them. "You want me to break or alter a witch's curse," Catherine said, still with that hint of amusement. "Marguerite Duval's work, unless I miss my guess." Her curses were always baroque, always designed to torture the subject emotionally rather than simply kill them. She had a gift for creative cruelty. Lucien spoke for the first time, his voice rough. "You knew her?" Catherine nodded, pouring tea from a pot that sat on the table, the liquid dark and aromatic. "We trained together briefly 40 years ago, before she decided that love was worth more than power, and I decided the opposite. I heard she died badly, cursed by the vampire she loved even as he killed her. Poetic justice of a sort, I suppose." She looked at Lucien directly, her amber eyes sharp. "You are him, though you do not remember her, do you? The curse stole those memories specifically, part of her revenge." Lucien shook his head slowly, his face pale. "I remember killing her, remember the moment I lost control, but her face is a blur. I can recall facts but not feelings, as if that part was excised deliberately." "It was," Catherine confirmed. "Marguerite wanted you to suffer the loss of love without remembering what you destroyed. Clever, if unnecessarily complicated. But that is not why you are here. You want me to modify the curse so that this one," she nodded at Eleanor, "does not have to die to free you, and so that you can maintain control over your vampire nature without the constant agony you currently experience. Am I correct?" Eleanor nodded, hope and fear warring in her chest. "Can you do it? Can you change what Marguerite created?" Catherine sipped her tea slowly, studying them both with those unnerving eyes. "Perhaps, but you should understand what you are asking for. Marguerite's curse is not just magic. It is powered by her death, by the love she felt, and the betrayal she experienced. That kind of fuel makes for very strong, very permanent magic. To alter it would require power of equal magnitude, a sacrifice of similar weight. The word sacrifice made Eleanor's stomach drop. What kind of sacrifice? Catherine set down her teacup, her expression becoming serious. Marguerite gave her life and her love to power the curse. To alter, it would require you to give something of equal value. Not death necessarily, but perhaps something equally precious. Time, for instance. Years of your life transferred to maintain the altered curse, or humanity itself. You could become like him, vampire alongside vampire. And in that transformation, the curse would shift, no longer needing to torture him with the balance between two natures, because you would both share the same nature. Eleanor felt the words hit like a physical blow. Become a vampire. Give up her humanity, her mortality, everything that made her herself. It was an impossible choice, or it should have been, yet she found herself considering it with a seriousness that surprised her. Lucien stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. No, absolutely not. Eleanor will not become a vampire. I will not condemn her to the existence I have lived, the darkness and the hunger, and the endless years watching everyone you love die. That is not a solution. That is trading one curse for another. His voice was fierce, protective, absolutely unbending, but Catherine just watched him calmly. Is it? She asked mildly. You speak as if your existence was nothing but suffering, yet here you are, willing to endure tremendous pain to hold on to the one good thing you have found in 300 years. Would immortality shared with her truly be worse than watching her age and die while you remain unchanged? At least, as a vampire, she would share your time frame, your experience. You would face the darkness together, rather than you facing it alone after she is gone. The words struck home. Eleanor could see it in Lucien's face, the way his absolute refusal wavered as Catherine's logic sank in. But still he shook his head. It is not her choice to make. I will not allow her to sacrifice her humanity for me. Eleanor stood as well, moving to stand in front of him, forcing him to look at her. It is absolutely my choice to make, she said firmly. My humanity, my life, my decision. Lucien, listen to me. I'm going to die regardless, probably within the next 50 years if I am lucky. And what will happen to you then? You will return fully to being a vampire, forgetting me, forgetting us, forgetting everything we built together. That is the inevitable end of this story unless we change it. But if I become like you, we have forever. We have time to truly build something, to learn and grow and exist together. Yes, it means becoming a vampire, means taking on the hunger and the darkness, but I would not face it alone. We would face it together, and that makes all the difference. Lucien's eyes were filled with tears, his hands shaking as he reached up to frame her face. You do not know what you are offering. The thirst is agony, Eleanor. The need for blood is constant. The guilt of killing to survive is crushing. I do not want that for you. I want you to remain the light you have always been, untouched by the darkness that has defined my existence. Eleanor covered his hands with hers, holding his gaze. I am already touched by that darkness simply by loving you. The only question is whether we face it together or separately. And Lucien, I choose together. I choose you. I choose us. I choose whatever life we can build, even if it means becoming something I never imagined I would be. I'm not afraid of the darkness, if you are there with me. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of the decision. And finally, Lucien's resistance crumbled. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she felt his tears wet against her neck. Are you certain? He whispered, his voice breaking. Truly certain, because once this is done, there is no going back. You will be vampire forever, and that is a very long time to regret a choice. Eleanor pulled back enough to look at him, to let him see the certainty in her eyes. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I want forever with you, Lucien. However that has to look, whatever form it takes, I want it. She turned to Catherine, who had been watching their exchange with unreadable eyes. Can you do it? Can you alter the curse so that my transformation breaks the balance, keeping Lucien trapped? Catherine nodded slowly. I can, But you should understand exactly what you are agreeing to. I will transform you first, turn you vampire through the traditional method. Lucien will need to drain you nearly to the point of death, and then give you his blood to complete the change. It is excruciating, and there is a small chance you will not survive it. If you do survive, you will wake as a vampire with all the hunger and strength that entails, and you will need to feed quickly or risk losing yourself to bloodlust. Once you are fully transformed, once you have killed to survive, the curse will recognize the change. Lucien's balance will shift because you will no longer be the mortal anchor holding him in liminal space. He will regain full vampire power and control, and you will both be what you are, what you were meant to be, perhaps. But Eleanor, understand this clearly, you will be a killer. You will need to feed on human blood to truly thrive, and every death will be on your conscience. Can you live with that? The question was brutal in its honesty, and Eleanor felt the full weight of what she was choosing. To kill, to take life to sustain her own, to become the monster that humans feared in their nightmares. Everything she had been raised to believe, every value her father had taught her, rebelled against the idea. But she looked at Lucien's face, at the love and fear and hope warring in his expression, and she knew that she would bear any burden, commit any sin, become any monster, if it meant they could be together. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. I can live with it. I will learn to live with it, with Lucien's help. We will face it together. Catherine stood, moving to a cabinet and pulling out supplies, vials and herbs, and a wicked-looking knife. Then we begin tonight. The transformation takes 3 days, and you will need to be isolated during that time while the change completes. Lucien will need to stay with you to provide blood and comfort, and I will monitor to ensure nothing goes wrong. Afterward, when you wake fully vampire, I will take you hunting so that your first kill is clean and quick. I owe that much to Marguerite's memory, ensuring that the woman who breaks her curse does so with as much humanity intact as possible. She laid out her tools with practiced efficiency, and Eleanor felt fear spike through her. This was real. This was happening. In a matter of hours, she would no longer be human, would never again be the person she had been. But she looked at Lucien and saw her future, saw forever stretching out before them. And she did not flinch from the choice. The transformation was agony beyond anything Eleanor had imagined, a pain so complete and consuming that it unmade her from the inside out and rebuilt her into something new. Lucien held her the entire time, his tears falling on her face as he bit into his own wrist and pressed it to her lips after draining her to the edge of death. His voice hoarse from whispering apologies and love and promises that everything would be all right. She believed him because she had to, because the pain was too great to bear without faith that it would end, that she would emerge on the other side changed but whole. The 3 days passed in a fevered dream of suffering and darkness, her human body dying by inches, her vampire nature slowly awakening to take its place. She woke on the 3rd night, with senses so sharp it was overwhelming. Every sound too loud, every scent too strong. The texture of the sheets beneath her feeling like sandpaper against hypersensitive skin. But most overwhelming was the thirst, a hunger so complete and desperate that it consumed every thought, every feeling, reducing her to pure need. She needed blood, needed it with an urgency that made breathing seem optional. And when Lucien leaned over her, concerned, asking how she felt, all she could focus on was the pulse in his throat, the scent of blood beneath his skin, the overwhelming need to feed. She lunged without conscious thought, faster than she had ever moved, tackling him back onto the bed with strength that shocked them both. Eleanor. "Stop!" Lucien said firmly, his hands gripping her shoulders, holding her back with the superior strength of someone who had been vampire far longer. "Look at me. Focus on my voice, not the thirst. You are stronger than this." But Eleanor barely heard him, struggling against his grip, her new fangs elongated, her entire being focused on the need to feed. It was Catherine who intervened, appearing in the doorway with a struggling animal, a rabbit that she tossed onto the bed between them. "Feed on that first," Catherine commanded. Take the edge off the hunger before you accidentally kill the one person you are trying to save. The rabbit's scent hit Eleanor like a physical force, and she released Lucien immediately, falling on the animal with a violence that her human self would have found appalling, but her vampire self found natural as breathing. The blood was extraordinary, warm and rich, filling the terrible emptiness inside her, and she drained the rabbit in seconds, feeling strength and clarity return as the worst of the hunger ebbed. When she looked up, embarrassed and horrified by her own actions, she found Lucien and Catherine watching her with expressions of sympathy and understanding rather than judgment. "The first hunger is always the worst," Catherine said quietly. "You did well to stop when you did, to redirect a prey I provided. Many new vampires cannot manage even that much control." Eleanor looked at the drained rabbit in her hands, at the blood staining her fingers, and felt the reality of what she had become settle over her like a shroud. She was a killer now, would need to kill to survive, and that rabbit was just the beginning. Lucien pulled her into his arms, seemingly unconcerned with the blood, holding her as she began to shake with reaction. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I tried to attack you." He could not control it. He stroked her hair, his touch gentle despite his own strength. "I know, mon âme. The first days are the hardest. But you stopped. You controlled yourself enough to redirect to other prey. That is more than I managed in my first hours as a vampire. You are already stronger than I was." His words were meant to comfort, but Eleanor still felt the weight of what she had done, what she would have to continue doing. But she also felt Lucien's arms around her, felt his heartbeat steady and strong, and knew that this was the price of forever, the cost of loving a vampire and choosing to become one. She would bear it, learn to bear it, because the alternative was losing him, and that was unacceptable. Catherine allowed them one night to adjust to Eleanor's transformation before she insisted they go hunting. "You need human blood to truly complete the change," she said firmly, ignoring Eleanor's protests. "Animal blood will sustain you, but it will never satisfy fully. You will always feel weak, always be fighting a hunger that cannot be truly sated. One human death, clean and quick, and you will understand what you truly are, what your body needs. After that, you can make your own choices about how you feed. But you need this foundation." She led them into the night, through woods that Eleanor could now see perfectly despite the darkness, every detail sharp and clear as if it were brightest day. Her new senses were intoxicating, overwhelming. The world revealed in ways she had never imagined, and she understood for the first time why Lucien had spoken of the transformation as both curse and gift. They found a man traveling alone on a lonely road, a merchant by his dress, and Catherine gestured for Eleanor to approach. "Make it quick. One bite, drink deep, stop his heart. He will feel very little pain if you are fast and sure." Eleanor felt revulsion and hunger war within her, but Lucien was beside her, his hand in hers, his presence steadying. "I'm with you," he whispered. "Whatever you need to do, I am with you." And somehow that made it possible. Eleanor approached the man with inhuman speed, caught him before he could scream, and bit deep into his throat. The blood was incredible, nothing like the rabbit, rich and complex, and filling her with power beyond anything she had imagined. She drank deep, feeling his heart slow and stop. Under her hands, feeling his life pour into her. And when it was done, when he lay dead at her feet, she felt both horrified and complete in equal measure. She stumbled back, looking at her hands stained with human blood, and began to sob. Lucien was there immediately, pulling her away from the body, holding her as she broke down. "I killed him," she gasped out between sobs. "I am a murderer. I'm exactly what I always feared." Lucien held her tighter, his own voice rough with emotion. "You are a survivor. You did what you needed to do to live. I know the guilt, Eleanor. I've carried it for 300 years. But you are not alone in this. We will carry the weight together, and perhaps together it will be bearable." Catherine dealt with the body efficiently, making it look like a robbery, and they returned to the cottage in silence. Eleanor numb with shock and grief and the terrible knowledge of what she was capable of, But something else came with that knowledge. Power. Eleanor woke the next evening, feeling stronger than she ever had. Her body thrumming with energy, her senses impossibly acute, her strength extraordinary. She could move faster than thought, could hear conversations from houses away, could see individual leaves on trees a mile distant. This was what Lucien had lived with for 300 years, this intoxicating power that made the human world seem fragile and slow. She understood now why he had lost himself to it, why controlling it required constant vigilance and choice. The vampire nature did not want to be controlled. It wanted to revel in its power, to hunt and feed and dominate. Resisting that was an act of will performed every moment of every day. Catherine called them both to her workroom that evening, and Eleanor saw that the space had been prepared for ritual. Candles and herbs arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Symbols drawn on the floor in what looked like salt and ash. "The curse is ready to be altered," Catherine said, without preamble. Eleanor's transformation has created the necessary change in the magical balance. Now we simply need to complete the ritual that will acknowledge that change and release Lucien from the liminal space he has been trapped in. "This will hurt," she added, looking at Lucien directly. "The curse has been part of you for 15 years, integrated into your very being. Ripping it out and replacing it with your true nature will not be pleasant." Lucien nodded, his expression resigned. "I have endured worse. Let us finish this." They stood in the center of the ritual space, Eleanor and Lucien hand in hand, and Catherine began to chant in a language Eleanor did not recognize, her voice rising and falling in complicated patterns that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Eleanor felt power gathering, felt magic pressing in from all sides, and then suddenly Lucien gasped, his hand tightening on hers painfully as he collapsed to his knees. She went down with him, holding him as his body convulsed, as something invisible seemed to tear through him, rewriting him from the inside out. He screamed, a sound of such agony that it broke her heart, and she could do nothing but hold him and whisper that she loved him, that it would end soon, that she was there. And then it was over. Lucien slumped against her, breathing hard, and Eleanor felt the change immediately. The fragile quality he had carried since she found him, the sense that he was balanced on a knife's edge between two states, was gone. He felt solid now, complete, no longer fighting himself but unified. He raised his head slowly, his grey eyes meeting hers, and she saw power there, the full force of a 300-year-old vampire, no longer suppressed or controlled by a curse. For a moment she felt fear, wondering if this creature was still the man she loved, or if the transformation had changed him fundamentally. But then he smiled, that same gentle, loving smile she had come to cherish, and she knew that Lucien was still himself, just finally, fully himself, after 15 years of being torn apart. "How do you feel?" she asked quietly, helping him to his feet. Lucien stood slowly, testing his body as if relearning how to inhabit it, and then he laughed, a sound of